As shadows lengthen across the backdrop of the early 20th century, an ominous presence emerges from the murk of history: the Gestapo, or the Geheimstaatspolizei, the secret state police. Established on April 26, 1933, under the rule of Hermann Göring and later Heinrich Himmler, the Gestapo was a powerful and terrifying tool of control, ushering in a reign of terror unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The Gestapo became an instrumental force for Adolf Hitler, consolidating his power and silencing dissent. The Gestapo's origins trace back to the early days of Nazi Germany, where Hitler's government needed a strong arm to suppress opposition to the regime. Hermann Göring, who was the Minister of the Interior for Prussia, created the organization to ensure the loyalty of German citizens and eliminate any threats to Nazi ideology. Initially, the Gestapo's influence was limited to Prussia, but by 1934, Heinrich Himmler took control of the organization and expanded it throughout Germany. Himmler, known for his cold and methodical approach, turned the Gestapo into a machine of oppression, with the singular goal of enforcing Nazi control over the population. Under Himmler's leadership, the Gestapo grew in both power and influence. It became a force that worked above the law, with officers granted the authority to arrest and interrogate individuals without judicial oversight. The mere mention of the Gestapo struck fear into the hearts of ordinary citizens. The organization thrived in the climate of terror it created, where anyone could become a target based on suspicion or false accusations. The Gestapo's role in Nazi Germany was not just that of a police force, it was a tool of psychological warfare, perpetuating a climate of fear and mistrust. A fascinating fact about the Gestapo's early days is the role of Reinhard Heydrich, who became one of its most notorious figures. Heydrich, who would later be dubbed the Butcher of Prague, played a central role in the development of the Gestapo. His ruthless efficiency and terrifying demeanor made him one of Hitler's most trusted lieutenants. Heydrich was integral in expanding the Gestapo's reach, ensuring that it operated with lethal efficiency throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. The Gestapo was more than just a police force. It was a key pillar in Hitler's grand design, an instrument of control and oppression that operated without legal limitations. It was empowered to use extreme methods to ensure complete conformity to Nazi ideology. The Gestapo's jurisdiction was extensive, stretching into every facet of life in Nazi Germany, from political dissent to racial purity, making it a feared and loathed entity. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Gestapo's operations was its ability to operate without oversight. It was exempt from the normal checks and balances that governed other aspects of German law enforcement, and it held the power to arrest, interrogate, and detain individuals without due process. Ordinary citizens were at risk of being accused, arrested, and tortured on mere suspicion, with no means of defending themselves. This unchecked power allowed the Gestapo to control the population through terror and fear. At its peak, the Gestapo had a relatively small number of agents, around 16,000 individuals responsible for monitoring the actions of millions. However, their true strength lay not in their numbers, but in their ability to manipulate and intimidate. The organization used fear as a weapon, ensuring that no one felt safe, even within their own homes. The Gestapo's reach extended far beyond the criminal realm. They were responsible for curbing any form of dissent, targeting political enemies, Jews, Romani people, and anyone deemed undesirable according to Nazi beliefs. The mere presence of a Gestapo agent in a neighborhood would silence potential resistance, making people afraid to speak out or even think critically about the regime. The Gestapo's tactics were varied and comprehensive. Surveillance was one of its most potent tools. They maintained a vast network of informants, with citizens reporting on each other's behavior. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and even family members were not immune from suspicion. The Gestapo's ability to infiltrate communities and monitor private lives contributed to the pervasive sense of paranoia that permeated German society during the Nazi era. Even the slightest hint of dissent could result in arrest, and those who were arrested were often subjected to horrific forms of interrogation and torture. The Gestapo's jurisdiction extended beyond the borders of Germany, particularly in occupied countries where it operated with absolute power. As Nazi Germany expanded its influence, the Gestapo's reach stretched across Europe, targeting resistance movements and anyone who dared defy the Nazi regime. Their brutality was not limited to arrests. They also played a pivotal role in implementing the Holocaust, rounding up Jews and sending them to concentration camps where they would meet their deaths. In this way, the Gestapo became a key player in Hitler's plan for global domination and the systematic extermination of those considered undesirable by the regime. The Gestapo's rise to power and its efficiency in enforcing Nazi terror were driven by three key individuals: Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and Heinrich Müller. These men were the architects of the Gestapo's terrifying operations, shaping the organization into one of the most ruthless and feared arms of the Nazi regime. Heinrich Himmler, the chief architect of the Gestapo, was a man of paradoxes. Born in Munich in 1900, Himmler's early years were unremarkable. He had a keen interest in agriculture and was even a former chicken farmer, but despite his humble beginnings, Himmler's political ambitions were clear. He joined the Nazi Party in the early 1920s, and by 1929, he had become the head of the SS, a paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party originally created to protect Hitler. Over time, Himmler transformed the SS into one of the most powerful organizations in Nazi Germany, a key instrument in the enforcement of Nazi policies. His appointment as head of the Gestapo in 1934 solidified his grip on the Nazi security apparatus. Himmler was a methodical and highly organized leader who understood that control over the population required not only brute force but also an atmosphere of constant surveillance and fear. Under his leadership, the Gestapo expanded its influence, operating above the law and with a sense of invincibility. Himmler believed in the concept of racial purity, and he used the Gestapo to purge Germany of what he deemed undesirable elements, including Jews, political dissidents, and anyone who stood in opposition to the Nazi ideal. His vision for the Gestapo extended beyond national borders, with Himmler overseeing operations in occupied territories and using the Gestapo to enforce Nazi policies throughout Europe. Reinhard Heydrich, another key figure in the Gestapo's development, was a man known for his cold ruthlessness. Born in 1904 in Halle, Germany, Heydrich's path to power began in the German Navy. Before he joined the SS in the late 1920s, he quickly gained recognition for his organizational skills and his willingness to implement violent authoritarian methods. Heydrich's rise through the ranks of the SS was meteoric, and by 1934, he was appointed to lead the Gestapo. Heydrich's leadership of the Gestapo was marked by brutality and efficiency. He was a man of striking contradictions, cultured, well-educated, and an accomplished violinist, yet he was also one of the most merciless figures in Nazi Germany. He earned the nickname the Man with the Iron Heart due to his ironclad commitment to Nazi ideology and his willingness to carry out Hitler's orders with terrifying precision. Heydrich was instrumental in the creation of the Final Solution, the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. He chaired the Wannsee Conference in 1942, where the bureaucratic details of the Holocaust were discussed and finalized. Heydrich's reign of terror was cut short when, in 1942, he was assassinated in Prague by Czech resistance fighters in a daring operation orchestrated by the British Special Operations Executive. His death marked a significant turning point in the Gestapo's operations and the broader Nazi regime, as it removed one of the most feared figures in the Third Reich. However, his legacy lived on, and the Gestapo continued to carry out its mission of terror under new leadership. Heinrich Müller, the third central figure in the Gestapo's leadership, embodied the anonymous, faceless terror that the organization represented. Born in 1900 in Munich, Müller was a career police officer who had served in World War I. He joined the Gestapo in 1934 and quickly rose through the ranks. Müller's role in the Gestapo was largely administrative, overseeing its daily operations and helping to implement the policies that fueled the regime's terror. Unlike Himmler and Heydrich, Müller was not a prominent public figure, but his quiet, efficient leadership made him one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany. Müller's leadership of the Gestapo extended from Heydrich's assassination in 1942 until the fall of the Nazi regime in 1945. He was a figure of chilling efficiency, directing the organization's efforts in identifying and eliminating perceived enemies of the state. Müller's personal life was shrouded in mystery, and after the collapse of the Third Reich, he vanished without a trace. Despite extensive manhunts and investigations, his fate remains unknown to this day. His disappearance has become one of the enduring mysteries of post-war history, adding to the mythos of the Gestapo as a shadowy, all-powerful organization. Together, Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller formed an unholy triumvirate that directed the Gestapo's operations with brutal efficiency. Their leadership turned the Gestapo into a symbol of terror, creating a climate of fear that spread across Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. The impact of their actions has left an indelible scar on history, and their names remain synonymous with the darkest aspects of Nazi rule. What is truly chilling about these three men is how their backgrounds and personalities were so divergent, yet they shared a single vision of absolute control and conformity. Himmler, with his seemingly unremarkable appearance, was a master manipulator using his authority to purge Germany of those deemed racially impure. Heydrich, with his cultured demeanor, was a calculating and ruthless enforcer of Nazi ideology, while Müller, the bureaucrat, was the personification of the Gestapo's cold, methodical nature. Together, they forged an organization that would strike fear into the hearts of millions, and their names would forever be associated with some of the most horrific crimes in human history. The Gestapo, under the leadership of these men, was not simply a police force, it was a machine of terror, one that functioned as an instrument of totalitarian control. Its reach extended far beyond the confines of the law, and its methods were brutal and effective. The Gestapo's efficiency was a result of the leadership provided by Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller, and their legacy continues to serve as a warning of the dangers of unchecked power and authoritarianism. The Gestapo's ability to maintain its stranglehold on German society was built not just on its physical power, but on its mastery of psychological warfare. The organization used fear and intimidation as its primary tools, ensuring that no one dared to oppose the Nazi regime. The Gestapo's methods of control extended beyond the use of force. They employed a variety of techniques to break individuals mentally and emotionally, ensuring their complete submission to the regime. One of the most notorious tactics used by the Gestapo was psychological intimidation. From the moment a person was detained, they were thrust into a world designed to break their spirit. The interrogations were meant to inflict not just physical pain, but mental anguish. The Gestapo used the fear of the unknown as a tool to psychologically torture prisoners. Victims were often kept in solitary confinement, subjected to prolonged interrogations, and deprived of sleep and food. The mere anticipation of torture was enough to break many individuals, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation and coercion. The physical methods used by the Gestapo were equally brutal. Victims were often subjected to beatings, electric shocks, and other forms of physical punishment. The infamous concentration chair, in which victims were bound to a chair for hours or even days, is just one example of the horrifying methods used by the Gestapo. These methods were designed not just to extract information, but to completely break the spirit of the detainee. The Gestapo's ability to maintain this climate of fear allowed them to operate with near impunity, knowing that the threat of torture was often enough to ensure compliance. The Gestapo also used the psychological method of dehumanization, stripping victims of their identity to make them more vulnerable. When victims were arrested, they were often given numbers, erasing their personal identities in favor of becoming a faceless statistic in the Nazi machine. They were made to feel worthless, powerless, and insignificant, traits that broke the morale of even the strongest individuals. This was especially effective when used in conjunction with other methods like constant surveillance and forced labor. But the Gestapo's methods weren't just confined to torture. The organization also relied heavily on surveillance and informants. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on one another, turning the people of Germany into unwitting informants. The Gestapo's network of spies was vast, and it permeated every corner of society. Whether through tapping phone lines, intercepting mail, or using informants, the Gestapo maintained a constant watch over the German population. Anyone who spoke out against the regime could be reported, arrested, and tortured. The Gestapo's tactics were not just about extracting information from suspected enemies of the state. They were about maintaining an atmosphere of constant fear. The mere rumor of a Gestapo visit was enough to silence entire communities. Many Germans lived in a state of constant anxiety, unsure if the Gestapo would come for them next. People were afraid to speak freely, even within their own homes. This climate of fear and suspicion created an environment where dissent was not just punished, it was crushed before it could even take root. The Gestapo also employed the strategy of creating an enemy within, using propaganda to sow distrust among the population. By framing Jews, political dissidents, and other marginalized groups as enemies of the state, the Gestapo made it easier for the general public to accept the organization's tactics. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to report anyone who appeared suspicious or who spoke out against the regime. The Gestapo had a vast network of informants, and in a society where everyone was a potential spy, no one was safe. Another method used by the Gestapo was forced confession, a technique that turned the judicial system into a farce. Detainees were often coerced into confessing to crimes they had not committed, a process that was often accompanied by threats of harm to their families or loved ones. This tactic ensured that the Gestapo's methods appeared legitimate, as confessions made under duress could be presented as evidence in court. The ability to manipulate the legal system was a significant tool of the Gestapo, as it allowed them to operate outside the law with minimal repercussions. The Gestapo's reign of terror finally came to an end with the collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945. After the war, many of the Gestapo's leaders were put on trial at the Nuremberg trials, a pivotal moment in history where the world attempted to reckon with the atrocities committed during the war. Among the prominent figures brought before the tribunal were Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and Heinrich Müller, the key architects of the Gestapo. However, not all of the Gestapo's leaders faced justice. Himmler, the man most responsible for the Gestapo's atrocities, committed suicide in May 1945, avoiding trial. Heydrich, known as the Butcher of Prague, had been assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in 1942. Müller, the Gestapo's last leader, disappeared after the fall of the Third Reich, his fate remaining unknown to this day. Despite the efforts to bring the Gestapo's leaders to justice, the legacy of the organization continues to haunt the world. The atrocities committed by the Gestapo during the Holocaust, together with their role in implementing the final solution, remain some of the darkest chapters in human history. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, was facilitated by the Gestapo's efficiency and ruthlessness. The Gestapo was not just a police force. It was a key player in the Nazi regime's campaign of terror and genocide. Even after the war, the Gestapo's influence lingered in the form of post-war fugitives. Figures like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, managed to escape immediate capture and sought refuge in South America. It wasn't until later in the 20th century that many former Gestapo officers were brought to justice for their crimes. These trials served as a bitter reminder of the Gestapo's brutal legacy, but they also highlighted the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of holding perpetrators of mass atrocities accountable.